Welcome to our episode of Biblical Archaeology, From the Ground Down. Presented by Bible Interact and hosted by Dr. George Sparks. Join us as we explore the fascinating world of the Bible from leading experts in the field of archaeology.
Good morning, people. My name is Dr. George Sparks, and this is Biblical Archaeology From the Ground Down, sponsored by Bible Interact. Today I have a special guest. It's Dr. David Graves, who received his PhD from Aberdeen University. Also, he has had lecture tours at different museums, especially the British Museum. He was my archaeological square supervisor when we were in Jordan at the Tel El Hammam excavation. And that's on the Jordan side. On the Israel side, he's been influential at the Temple Mount, and it's the Temple Mount Sifting Project. Also, he's been at Shiloh, and that's just to name a few. He has a large series of books that we're going over today. We're going to be introducing his book, Jesus Speaks to the Seven Churches. And we're going to start with one particular church, the Church of Smyrna. And what's interesting about the Church of Smyrna is that there's activities there that we're so familiar with, and so is Hollywood, such as the 666. And Dr. David Graves is going to explain this event in the book of Revelations and what this 666 really means.
Smyrna is one of the seven churches mentioned in Revelation. It is the modern city of Izmir in Turkey and an interesting site with limited archaeological remains due to the fact that the modern city is built over much of the ruins. Dr. Graves, in the tradition of Sir William Ramsay and Colin Hemmer, has identified several local references in the message to Smyrna recorded in Revelation which are very informative. The references include such items as the Homenoia coins that indicate a close relationship with Laodicea, Thyatira, and Philadelphia. The citizens of Smyrna would be familiar with this claim of primacy from the well-known rivalry with Ephesus and Pergamum to be the first in Asia. While Smyrna claimed to be the first of Asia in beauty and size, Christ declares that he is the first and the last, providing a superior foundation for security as the eternal Savior. Faustina the Younger, wife of Marcus Aurelius, paid for the repairs after Smyrna was damaged by an earthquake in AD 178. The origin and meaning of the name Smyrna is concealed by ancient mythology and legends, but it is almost certain that the city developed the name from its trading connections with the spice trade of myrrh, which in Hebrew means bitter. While Western Asia Minor does not produce the myrrh spice, they traded it with Saudi Arabia. It is notable that myrrh is used only 3 times in the New Testament outside of the name of this city, and every time it is in relation to the life and death of Jesus. It was one of the expensive gifts brought to the infant Christ by the Magi. Again, at the close of Christ's ministry, myrrh was mixed with wine to hide the bitter taste of the wine. Myrrh's antiseptic properties were also used in embalming the body of Christ. Thus, the use of myrrh in the New Testament was connected with the humiliation and suffering of Christ, and is consistent with the theme of martyrdom. The name of Smyrna is certainly appropriate for a city which would come to know significant suffering. The message to Smyrna promises to the overcomers the crown of life, which is known from the crown of athletic victory. During the excavation of the Agora, one of the earliest Christian graffiti was uncovered. Written in Greek, it reads, "The one who has given the Spirit," which is a reference to Jesus Christ. This graffiti suggests that there were Christians living in the city of Smyrna. Also, in the Agora of Smyrna, researchers discovered several examples of gematria, from which we get our English word geometry, an ancient Hebrew practice of assigning numerical values to letters in a name or phrase. This technique, known as isopsephism in Greek, was used to communicate messages of love, sex, and religion. Adding up the individual numbers produces a single number that can be used to convey these messages. For further information on the message to Smyrna, including academic footnotes, consult our book Jesus Speaks to Seven of His Churches, part of the Biblical Archaeology series, and visit our website, smyrnaean.blogspot.com, where you can find a description of each of our books, which are available on Amazon.com.
Dr. David Graves, welcome to our program.
Great, George. Great to be with you.
The topic today is going to be Smyrna in the book of Revelation. And John the Apostle is speaking to the church And, depending on, you could say, what type of church we attend, is handled quite differently. Sometimes it seems like that Hollywood has been the big influence on the book of Revelation to our churches. And maybe you can help us sort out, if you will, this bag of snakes.
I don't know if I can solve all the problems, but it was always an interest to me to look at the seven churches, and that's what I focused my PhD research on at the University of Aberdeen. And I focused on the history and the first century context of these churches, looking at the local references that we find in the text to the history and the first century context that we have in history. I didn't try and impose, a particular eschatological view on the text, but what I wanted to do is to see what there is in the first century archaeology and history that is reflected in the text. And that's what my commentary does, a chapter on the history of the city, and then a chapter on the exegesis of the text. So Smyrna was the one that I focused on for my dissertation. The key theme really for Smyrna is the idea of persecution or tribulation. Chapter 2, verse 9 of Revelation says, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but a synagogue of Satan. Now, the idea of the name of the city, and the meaning of the name, was intriguing to me. It's the modern day city of Izmir, which is a large city in Turkey. It's right on the coast. I've stayed there many times. The name Smyrna actually comes from the Hebrew word which means myrrh. Now, myrrh is a spice that was traded in the ancient Near East. We find 3 references of it in the New Testament. Outside of it being used for the city itself, we have it referenced in the stories of Jesus, in his life and his martyrdom. We have it in the Magi gifts. Remember, the Magi brought myrrh to Jesus at his birth. At his death, we have it mixed with wine. And we also have it in the embalming process in John 19. So Matthew 2, Mark 15, and John 19, myrrh is all associated with the life, birth, and death of Jesus Christ. So his exaltation and his death, which I find rather interesting. Myrrh, the spice, has the idea of bitter, the idea of suffering. And we see that in the death of Jesus. Well, the city of Smyrna is very, very embedded in the idea of suffering. In the first century, the city, of course, was a fairly large city, about 250,000 at the time of Paul, an important commercial center. There's lots of coins and inscriptions that say that Smyrna was the first of Asia in beauty and size and most brilliant and metropolitan of Asia. And thrice temple warden, this is the Neokoros, which means the keeper of the temple of the imperial cult, according to the degree of the most sacred senate. So we find that it had an idea here of being a primary city in Asia Minor. Smyrna had the closest relationship in the Greek coins. We have what was a Roman coins, we call it hominoia, which is a close relationship with other cities. So they had this kind of coordination and harmony with other cities. Laodicea, Thyatira, and Philadelphia were the 3 cities that it was in harmony with. So they shared lots, and they were in competition with Ephesus for being the first of Asia, the largest city. So you had this competition going on. In the first century, we find that it was persecuted. The Christians in Smyrna were persecuted by the Romans and the Jews. And thus it was called the synagogue of Satan by John. And the reason for that was not something that was anywhere anti-Semitic. It was a simple fact that it was the Jews that were turning the Christians over to the Romans because they were jealous that the Christians were included. The Jews had an exemption on sacrificing in the temple in the first century to the Roman imperial cult. So the Jews didn't have to sacrifice. They were exempt. Now, the Christians initially were brought under that as a sect of Judaism in the first century. So the Christians didn't have to sacrifice initially to the Roman imperial cult. But the Jews were jealous of that because they said, these Christians are not part of our religion. They're a sect, a breakaway, and we're jealous. And so the Jews began turning the Christians over to the Romans for persecution. We see that in the martyrdom of Polycarp, who was the bishop of Smyrna. AD 155 is when he was persecuted. And we have his account when you read it, as well as the account of Pionius in 250 AD. Both were martyred. Both were from Smyrna. They were handed over by the Jews to the Romans to be persecuted. That's where we have probably a reference to the synagogue of Satan. Those that claim to be Jews and were not. They're not real Jews. They're turning the Christians over to the Romans. And that's where that phrase comes from, I believe, in the book of Revelation and one of the other churches in Revelation.
If I might just interject a little bit here, the book of Revelation starts off with this idea, at least when I read it, we got 7 churches that are represented as one of the branches of the menorah. And with that in mind, I would think of, the way the temple was before the destruction, that was in the holies of holies, and it was a part of the ceremonies of Judaism. But so I still have that image in my mind that the 7 churches being represented of the candlestick, the menorah, has a symbolism somehow with the Judaism. And I could be wrong, but just that candlestick alone. Another thing is that Smyrna, meaning myrrh, and you mentioned that myrrh, of course, was a gift to the Christ child, as it's in the scriptural narrative. But the wise men actually have picked up myrrh from Smyrna. Now, it's just a thought. Or could they picked it up somewhere in Arabia and used the trade route going through Petra to get, around the southern end of the Dead Sea? Now, I'm way off topic, but it's just like, I just thought it was interesting. You know what else is interesting? And then we'll carry on.
Let me answer that for you.
Right, okay, thank you.
What we have is there was no myrrh being manufactured or produced in Anatolia or Asia Minor. It came from Saudi Arabia, and the trade route came up through the King's Highway, up through the West Bank of Israel, and then up through into Anatolia or Turkey, modern day Turkey. And so the people in Smyrna were trading in this. The wise men would have brought this up through the trade routes and passed by Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and then they would carry on up through, probably taking their trade up into Smyrna.
Years ago, one more thing. My dad was actually a dentist, and years ago, this is back in the 70s. I hate this, it's the 70s. And I set chairside for him. And back then we didn't have to have any type of certificates. We could just be trained. So I was trained by my father to work alongside. And that's what I did to help work through college. And when he was pulling teeth or making dentures, we'd have to file down the bones and then stitch the gums back together. And he would put this, it was like a thick, gooey, deep red color ointment. And he'd get it out of a little bottle about this big. And it was like on a Q-tip. And he'd take it. And he said, this is actually by weight more than gold. That's what he told me. And this has been way back in the 70s. And I said, well, Dad, what is it? And he says, actually, it's benzoin and myrrh. And he would put it over the gums, and where the mouth would have sores in them where people would accidentally bite their gums. And he actually applied it to me one time. I had to get some, and I'll tell you what, it healed so fast with the myrrh. So, in a way, what was myrrh? Frankincense and myrrh. Myrrh could, in a way, be represented as maybe a healing agent, just as I'm going to use some out there with symbolic symbolism, if you will, a type of healing. And maybe this is also represented. I'm saying maybe, and we'll go on. I apologize, I'm dragging. Maybe this is also represented in the in the text, that the people, are suffering, but they're in Smyrna, and there's going to be a healing, because it also says, but you are rich, but you are rich. I just wanted to throw that out there. That's all. I'm not saying that's the way it is.
Interesting. I never heard the dental reference before on myrrh, but it was used in a lot of medical situations, and we see it in the embalming, of course, of Jesus. We see it in the mixing with the wine, but the primary meaning of it was bitter. So it did probably have some healing properties. I have one reference to healing properties when we get to one of the other cities. We'll talk about Hierapolis later. Anyway, so we have the persecution of people in Smyrna, had a long history of it, even up until the modern day, 1922, we have the burning of the city. So it continues for many, many, many years. The city of Smyrna has had a history of tribulations, but they will be the overcomers. Those who overcome the persecution are promised the crown of life. The crown of life is related to the crown of the athletic victory, where a crown was worn in the cultic rituals, the honorary crown and the laurel crowns depicted on the coins. There's a coin from Smyrna where we have two different crowns on the obverse and the reverse side of the coin. A laurel crown. And in a couple of the museums, I think I've got a couple of photographs of these from the Aphrodisias Museum of the crowns and what they look like. There was a new one just discovered actually in England. I just saw the other day of a beautiful crown from the 1st century. So this idea of the crown was very, very prominent. But the overcomers who overcame the persecution would receive the crown of life, or the wreath of like the athletes when they were victorious in the race. So that's a very picturesque image of the victory of the Christians who overcome the persecution in the city of Smyrna. The archaeology of the city of Smyrna has been hindered a lot by the modern city that has encompassed all of the ancient ruins. One of the few areas that have been excavated and still remains today in the entire city is the small area of the agora that included a basilica, a church, as well as what we call the cryptoporticus. This is a mall sort of underground, so it went up 2 stories. So you have an underground or a basement mall, and we call it a cryptoporticus, had beautiful arches, and these have been excavated. And this work has been done in the last number of years. I was there in 2007, I think, might have even been 2005. I'd have to go look back. I don't remember anymore. But excavations were resumed in 2002 after the Germans and the Turks had done some work there. The Turkish government, the Izmir Archaeological Museum, conducted excavations, and they did a part of the basilica and part of the Western Stoa and the cryptoporticus. I have some photographs when I was there that I took. 2004 is when I was there, and I took my photographs. They chased me off the site because I was in the area where they were doing some excavations, and I wasn't allowed in the area. I had permission because I was an archaeologist, but they chased me out. But I did get some photographs, and I've published them. what they did there. But one of the things that they discovered were a number of graffiti on the walls. One of the inscriptions, one of the graffiti that they have there is probably one of the earliest references to Christians in the city. The one who has given the Spirit, that is the Lord, Jesus. We have that on an inscription on the wall in Smyrna. So we know there were Christians there. One of the other graffiti that we have on the wall relates and connects to 666. So that's where we're going to go with 666. What many people do not realize, we don't read it a lot in contemporary commentaries, it is mentioned in some of them, is the whole idea of the practice of, in Greek it's called isophysicism, and in Hebrew it's called Gematria. And some of the messages used were using this this practice of turning names into numbers. It was a common practice. It's well documented and well known. What's interesting is that we find this practice now in one of the 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation that also mentions a name and a number and who can figure out the puzzle. The idea that we have on these inscriptions, the inscriptions themselves, read 616. So we have a secret code similar to the one that is used in Revelation in 13 verse 18 for the number of 666. 3 female names in the same building are identified representing 616. One reads, I love a woman whose number is 616. The other one says, whose number is 731. And another one says, whose number is 1308. We have lots of examples of this. And what they would do is they would take each number or each letter of the alphabet in Greek or in Hebrew, and they would assign a number to it. And you would add up the numbers of the name, and you get a number. Now, what's interesting is that the Emperor Nero, when you add up his numbers or of his name, they come out to 666. And what is also very interesting is that we have a manuscript variant in the New Testament that reads 616. Nero and Neron, one is 666 and the other is 616. So the variant manuscript that we have of the book of Revelation verifies this notion that in the first century idea, in their minds as Christians, they understood what the code meant in the book of Revelation, because they didn't want to come out and say Nero was the beast, because that would be against the Romans, and they didn't want to be persecuted by the Romans. So what John does is he puts it in code, and if you can figure out the code with a common practice we find on the walls of Smyrna, 616 or 666, he was calling Nero the beast. And that's what the Christians in the first century understood it to be. And there's no doubt in my mind now, having seen the archaeology that backs up this notion of Gematria. It was a common practice, and we see it on the walls. We also see it in Pompeii. So in the graffiti of Pompeii, we have the same idea of people's names being converted into numbers. And we see it in other texts as well in the ancient Near East. I'll put a chart up on how the names are conveyed, the numbers in the Hebrew and the Greek. So some people say, no, the book of Revelation was written in Greek, and you're saying that the numbers in Hebrew from Gematria. Well, remember that John says he has the wisdom to figure out the code, the mystery in the numbers. He also knew Hebrew, and so the numbers in Hebrew add up to 666. Neron Caesar, 666. Nero Caesar, 616. and Jesus is 888.
So the letters, what you're saying, the letters represent numbers.
That's right.
The letters in the name are adding up to certain numbers. That's what's going on. That's not going to set well with Hollywood, especially movies like The Omen. That's just, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm sad. We talked about this earlier. I saw all those movies, and now it's just like boom, man. There's no mark in the palm of the hand, no stamp on your forehead, nothing.
No.
This is actually referring to the knowledge and a practice 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. The key to understanding the book of Revelation is know your Old Testament. And second, what did it mean to the first century Christians?
I appreciate that because I know my Hollywood, but I just didn't know that.
Unfortunately, that's the problem with many Christians today. They don't know their history. They don't know their geography. They don't know their archaeology. And it helps us to understand the meaning of what it meant in the original culture and context in which it was written. And so if they want to understand the mystery, understand the archaeology of 666.
And once again, this is in your book, Jesus Speaks to the Seven Churches by Dr. David Graves. And once again, there's a lot of information in there, and Smyrna is just one chapter, and it's pretty intense. And doctor, I learned a lot because seriously, I don't know how many churches, especially in the 70s and 80s, where you had that satanic panic. You remember that?
Yeah.
And we were and I think the end of the 70s, that little barcode started coming out on products, and we started scanning them. And some churches, I'm going to say all, but some churches went crazy thinking like this is the end times. This is it. Be careful you don't get one of these stamps on your forehead or on your hand, and absolutely nothing to do with the biblical text.
Yeah.
And this
now
is what
I will say this, George,
yes,
that now that we understand what it meant to the people in the first century, we are better able to apply the biblical text to our modern day context. I don't believe it was referring to the barcode or any of that nonsense, but how do we deal with an oppressive regime like the Romans as Christians in the 20th century? And we can draw lessons from the text of the book of Revelation for our day today.
Right. Well, maybe it has something to do with Smyrna being
I think
Myrrh,
it might.
and
the overcomers receive the crown of life.
And overcome. So, like you said, if you're going to win a race and you look at the Olympics, you're going to have to be pretty good. And it'll take skill and practice. And we live in a world today with the tribulations that we have. I'll use tribulations. That it's going to take skill to get through this.
And we're promised, if we overcome, the crown of eternal life.
You know what? That's a good way to end it. And I appreciate it. Remember to like and subscribe, people. And don't forget to get your books. These are just a little bit of Dr. Graves. You heard right now. And how much have we learned? And get your victory in your mind over these little things like the barcodes and things, like we worry about needlessly because it wasn't true. Hey, doctor, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you, George.